I'm author and critic David Agranoff. I'm a horror and science fiction author, critic, and researcher. In this podcast, I wanted to provide in-depth interviews and panel discussions with everyone from New York Times bestselling authors to researchers, musicians, and anyone I find interesting. Welcome to Postcards from a Dying World. Hello and welcome to Postcards from a Dying World. We have a very special episode for you today. We are up in I think this is going to be episode 106. I always say that, but then I move numbers around. So I don't know why I even mentioned the numbers, but David James Keaton is a guest I have flirted with a couple times because I've wanted him on before for panels and things and just never got around to it. But I'm really excited to have him here to talk about his new book, Head Cleaner, which we'll get to in a minute. I got to make a shameless plug for my most recent book, Nightmare City, co-written with Anthony Trevino, who is
I know that guy.
Yeah,
I know him.
Yeah, Anthony's a big David James Keaton fan. The first David James Keaton book I ever read, The Last Projector, was handed to me by Anthony. So
you can't ask for that kind of that's some serious promo there. He's carrying around copies of it.
Well, I don't know if he was carrying around, but I just think he wanted me to read it very badly. But yeah, that was Anthony. And
he helped me put a mannequin in a trunk once. So we're like this after that.
Right. And we wrote a whole fucking book together that took 4 years. So we're like that, but trying to be like this, you know? So, but anyway, shout out to Anthony, who may or may not listen to this episode, but our book Nightmare City is out there, and we pitched it as The Wire if Clive Barker and Philip K. Dick were on the writing staff. So,
okay. All right. Well, wait, which season of The Wire? They're all drastically different.
I'm going to go season 1, maybe. Okay.
All right.
It's not a hard pitch. It's like we're going for feel here.
Well, if you would have said season 2, the bottom would have dropped out because that's the season no one likes. The season at the docks. Right.
I actually don't mind season 2.
It's okay. I mean, comparatively, it's really good, but the other ones were so good.
I'm not going to go as far as saying I like True Detective season 2, but The Wire season 2, I don't think is that bad.
Season 3 made season 2 look like season 1.
Well, of True Detective?
Yes.
I actually don't mind season 3, but we're not here to talk about True Detective.
We're not? Fuck.
Yeah, but at least season 2 and season 3 didn't carbon copy dialogue out of Thomas Ligotti books.
That's true. But they ripped off somebody else in 2, didn't they? It was somebody had the Birdman sequence. Somebody was telling me about it that he took from, I don't want to say, it's not Elmore Leonard, some other hard-boiled detective. Hold on a second. Oh, hey, we got some coffee. Nice.
Oh, hey.
Thanks.
Well, welcome to the coffee.
Look at this. I'm going to be talking a mile a minute now.
All right. Well, it's funny, David, because one of the things that I know about you before we get into this book is that, and I said this in my review, and I know you haven't read my review yet, but I kind of know you as more than an author. I know you as somebody who's making hilarious media criticisms from time to time, or ones that I follow, even if I don't agree with them all the time. And that comes out in this book a little bit too. Which we'll get to, because we're going to get into nitty gritty eventually. There's going to be a spoiler warning at some point, but until then, people can follow along in our conversation. But so that's kind of my first thing that I think of when I think of you, is that if I see one of your posts on some show or something, I always stop scrolling to see what you've got to say. But here's the thing. Well, it's funny too, because I know some people only like to read the opinions of people they agree with. right?
Yeah.
And that's not me. I like sometimes like to read when somebody like just totally doesn't agree with me. And I can't remember, there was one time you made a comment on something that I completely disagreed with, but I was like, but still well said. And so that's why I always read your stuff. But that's besides the point. How did
Well,
you get in?
honestly, let me just
Yeah,
stick up for myself for a second. When I'm disagreeing with maybe some sort of if it seems like a really good piece of media, and I come off like a contrarian, the person I'm arguing with is myself, because I almost always am ripping on things that I really enjoy. If it's something
right.
that's terrible, I rarely even talk about it. But if it's something that I've seen a million times, like recently I watched The Prestige for probably the sixth or seventh time. My sister was in town, and it's just so fun to tear it to shreds. I love that movie, but I can't help but just sort of immerse myself in like nitpicking it. It's like I think it's fun, and then I find that a lot of people don't think that's fun at all. That a lot of people think, oh, you hate everything.
Yeah.
Not true. In fact, that this book was a chance to make that crossover with the voice, the media voice, like the media saturated social media voice. It finally gave it a place to run amok, more so than the other books. And some people, like my
Yeah.
wife was saying, that it actually finally makes sense. Like the rants finally had a place where they made more sense than some books they get kind of off the rails. But
Right.
this one seems like it is sort of those guys at the video store. And you've been talking on Facebook, you were talking about a video store past of your own, I think, or some sort
Yeah.
of, or at
Yeah.
least in
Recently, when we were talking about DEF CON 4, you can imagine, or DEF CON 5, you can imagine what book I was reading that inspired me to think about that. Um, but yeah, no, and we'll talk about video stores in a little bit because I think it's a curious thing. And and personally, and living in Portland, I like held I was using Movie Madness, right up
oh
to the
wow.
end of living in Portland. And when we left in 2014, I was still using Movie Madness on a regular basis, right?
Mm.
And it's funny because I heard recently that they transitioned, because they still have Movie Madness there, and they transitioned into building a screening room, because there's a lot of people that just don't have machines anymore to watch the things, but you can
Wow.
now go there and rent the screening room and get a movie that you want to watch that's only there, and get the
Wow.
screening room.
I love the seedy nature of that. Like it
Yeah.
sounds sort of like those Times Square porno shops, except people are just watching a totally normal movie, and the only cleanup required is popcorn. But yeah, that's
What?
like those. Do you remember there was a minute when there were like single viewing stations? I don't know if those were overseas, but you would watch. They wanted to get so many when movies were huge. They wanted to play so many that
Right.
instead of putting a lot of people in an auditorium, they did a reverse where it was like 3 or 4 people in front of a monitor. And so they reduced the number of people per spot, but the number of screens was multiplied. And it didn't really catch on, unless this is like a dream I had, but I'm pretty sure that for a moment they tried this when movies were in their heyday in the theaters. So it's interesting that now that rentals, you're saying that so many people want to watch this old media but don't have the devices. So
Yeah.
you don't even go home anymore. You just stay there and watch it.
Right. Now, a lot of people in Portland still have the devices, so they're still able to do it. But Mike Clark, the founder of Movie Madness, is kind of like the Bigfoot of this podcast, because I had on the head programmer from the Hollywood Theater in Portland, and he kept saying, you got to have Mike Clark on, the owner of Movie Madness, because he has amazing stories because he worked in the film industry before he opened the video store. And so the
Mhm.
idea was to have him on to come talk about running his video store and tell his movie stories. And I set up a date to have him on the podcast, and he is terrible with technology, and getting him on Zoom was like next to impossible. And we spent 35 minutes with his nephew trying to get his Zoom to work. And the whole time he's telling these great stories. And then he was like, fuck it, this isn't working. He was like, thanks for the offer. And then he hung up on me.
Wow.
And I never got the chance to have him on the podcast. And so now anytime anyone mentions Movie Madness, and I have a shirt for Movie Madness, when I wear the shirt, I just laugh about that 35 minutes I spent with him and his nephew trying to figure out Zoom. But it never worked, but that's okay. But video stores are a weird kind of thing. And we'll come back to that. But I do want to get into a little bit. I'm feeling super tangenty today. So bear with me.
Suits the material.
Yeah, it does. So how did you get into writing and genre fiction or just writing in general? Because I know your work isn't entirely genre, but
it's definitely a hybrid. I guess the first couple stories I wrote though were heavily genre stories. It was junior high stuff. We had a school newspaper. So I wrote a couple stories for our school newspaper, and they were, I had seen Alien right around that time was the first time I'd seen the first Alien movie. So everything I was writing involved something coming out of a body in some way.
Some kind of body horror of some kind. Yeah.
But real basic stuff. Like one of them was, I lived near Davis-Bessie's nuclear power plant in Ohio. So there was a lot of talk of, mutation, radiation and stuff. And there was beaches right there. So the first story I wrote was, I think it was just called On the Beach. I didn't realize there was already a movie called On the Beach about nuclear fallout. And it was somebody steps on a sand crab, but it's a special crab. So it injects eggs into their foot. And then later their foot explodes into sand crabs and they go everywhere. And then about 2 years later, I wrote one called Spider Bites, which was, somebody goes to a pet store, but it's a special pet store, and they step on a special spider and it injects something into their foot, and then years or months later, spiders burst out of their chest. So you see that a pattern had emerged pretty quickly of just things bursting out of things. So that was probably the first things I wrote. Some of them were in school newspaper, multiple photocopies being passed around kind of thing. And then in undergrad, I got a BFA at Bowling Green in Ohio, Bowling Green State University in Ohio, and wrote a lot of, it was sort of memoir / magic realism stuff, not a lot of genre stuff. But then when I got to the University of Pittsburgh and I started working with Chuck Kinder, whose claim to fame with most people is that the movie Wonder Boys is based on him. Michael Chabon wrote that about him. Mm-hmm. So he, weirdly enough, his stuff was so out there, and it was also memoir kind of magic realism, that he kind of pushed me further and further into more outlandish material. And it was kind of a resistance to the MFA writing that I was reading in the workshops, which was all very, very literary.
Right.
So
now is University of Pitt, that's Pitt, right?
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. That's my father's
awesome.
grad school alma mater. And
so he knows the Cathedral of Learning, the Hogwarts looking Cathedral of Learning. On you. Yeah,
my father has a lifelong, his greatest academic love as an academic was his time at Pitt.
Oh, okay. So
for many, we had, and he adopted all the Pittsburgh sports teams when he was there.
The terrible towel and all that stuff.
Oh yeah, he was big Steelers, Pirates, the whole deal. And it's weird because I hoop with a lot of guys from Pittsburgh here, and they're like, you know a lot about Pittsburgh, and I'm like, and never spent much time there. It's just my dad, But that's cool. You went to Pitt. I didn't know about the guy that inspired Wonder Boys. That's cool because I love the novel and the movie.
Oh, okay.
So that's pretty cool.
I mean, they kind of screw some stuff up, but he's in real life, he had a cane and he had some trouble getting around from his, years of hard partying, basically. But in the movie, they insert a dog attack to sort of explain why he stumbles around. There's these weird, it's like they want the flavor of him. He absolutely would probably walk around in a giant pink bathrobe and but and in class
Right.
he was sort of similar, both dismissive but very intently into certain people's work. It's kind of an old school MFA workshop where probably wouldn't be embraced some of his methods, but
Right.
the version of him they came up with for the movie is fascinating because you can see why some choices were made, and you can see some of the stuff that he absolutely would say. If you're a big fan of the book and the movie, the sequences where him and people around him would start making up stories about people that they're looking at. You remember those moments? Like when he's in the bar and he says, okay, this guy was a former jockey, and they assassinated a horse, and just that kind of stuff is absolutely Chuck. That's the kind of thing that he would have. His imagination was always flying, and he was always he was a heavy weed smoker, so that is also in there as well.
I'm gonna have to see that again because I definitely love that movie. I just haven't seen it in a long time.
Well, if you want to
read the book around the time the movie came out, because
a good companion piece is Honeymooners, is the novel that he was writing that in the movie gets blown away. That's the novel that he was writing when he couldn't finish it, and it got to be thousands of pages, and Michael Chabon famously saw the manuscript and that it was into the 2,000 some pages, and he cut it down to, I think, 270 pages. I'm not sure what the final product is. So if you read Honeymooners, that's the book he's working on. But if you want a more Wonder Boys, Chuck Kinder type book, you should read the next one, which is The Last Mountain Dancer. And that one's a very sprawling, it's exactly the kind of sprawling book that you'd imagine the character of Grady Tripp would write, except with a little more twang to it. But yeah, Pittsburgh, that's where I started really writing a lot, and started sending out some short stories. And kind of as a side note, while I was there, they were filming The Dark Knight Rises. So it was kind of an interesting time. There was fake snow everywhere. Those camouflage little tank Hummer looking deals from the movie were kind of tooling around our streets. So it, you got this sort of literary castle, and then you've got Batman being filmed out the window. So I don't know, it was kind of conducive to the hybrid thoughts I was having, which is, it's not quite horror, it's not quite science fiction, it's kind of crimey, not quite literary. And that might hurt it finding audiences, that it's tougher to pin down. This new one is probably the closest to a straight genre piece, but it's still straddling it. It's still straddling the line a little bit.
Well, and it's funny because I know I pointed this out in my review, which is that it may be funny that with 2 short story collections and several novels out, that I spent a little bit of time in my review talking about your Facebook posts about media, but they related to the movie or to the book to me in a way because, like you said, this is a chance where you got to funnel a lot of those.
And honestly, I've always done that. The Facebook posts are kind of rehearsals for what some characters are saying sometimes. Like there's definitely a bleed through of what you're seeing on Facebook is probably rough draft material anyway. I mean, there's a reason why some posts can be a brick of text. And why people's responses that I know are be like, who are you talking to? Who are you yelling at? Like, that was just some sort of typing I was doing. So yeah.
And so of your earlier work, now I'm going to focus on Head Cleaner because this is the one that you're promoting. It's the one I just read. But of your earlier work, is there anything that you really want to point people to, or something that you think might be a good companion to this? Because it seems like The Last Projector is a companion piece in the thematics of like dying transmission of media, I guess is what.
Yeah. I think that one's if it was one of those, the Amazon page, if you liked this, try this. I would probably say The Last Projector. If you're really into genre stuff, I did have a zombie collection, which was sort of anti-zombie, but not really. Stealing propeller hats from the dead. I would say that might be a good companion. Although probably the closest in tone to it is the She Was Found in a Guitar Case,
Mhm.
which
Now I
was
gotta
written.
ask about propeller hats
Sure.
because for dickheads, I just interviewed Walter Nelson, the son of Ray Nelson, who claims to have invented the propeller hat. And I don't know if you have like a strong feeling on that since you had propeller hat in the title. But Ray
Yeah.
Nelson claims that he invented the propeller hat for science fiction to wear to a science fiction convention in the late 40s.
Okay.
Thus,
Do I owe
They
him money?
Live and the propeller hat have the same creator,
Huh.
right? Because Ray Nelson wrote the
He
story
wrote
that They Live was based on.
what is it, like 12 o'clock in the morning? What's that story?
8 o'clock in the morning.
8
Yes.
o'clock in the morning.
Yes.
Okay.
So
Interesting. So he's inventing a lot of things, that dark sunglasses, propeller hats.
well, you know, in the book, sunglasses aren't the reason why people start seeing the aliens. In the story, it's because they go to the guy goes to a hypnotist and tells him to wake up.
It's very Office Space. Like,
well, that's also very Phil K. Dick, but they were best friends in the 60s. So yeah, you know.
Yeah.
But anyways, just because you had propeller hat in the title, like as soon as I saw that, I was like, you know, I just interviewed Walter Nelson. Ray Nelson just passed away like a month or two ago at 91. And so I interviewed his son, which, by the way, I found out that Philip K. Dick used to babysit him. And what an experience that would be, is to like that your parents thought Phil Dick was the person they should leave you with. But whatever, you know. But yeah, Ray Nelson invented the propeller hat, allegedly. And so we do talk about that in that interview. But you think the guitar case collection is the one that is more thematically connected?
Well, I think thematically, Last Projector, I think you're right about that. As far as the voice, even though Head Cleaner's third person, attached, depending on what chapter you're in, Guitar Case is first person, but it's kind of a similar guy. And it's if you're into Pittsburgh, or it's essentially a diary of living in Pittsburgh and Louisville at the time. And it's also a hybrid. I think it may be just because it was the last thing I wrote before this. So it's there is some of that crossover. But the Last Projectors, I think, is the obvious one because of the movie connection, and because it's a lot of book. There's at least 3 competing plots going on in there, and you know, if you don't like the one, just look for the italics and read the one that's in italics instead. They may dovetail, or they may not. I don't know, but there's a lot there as far as movies and the history of movies, and that's probably the one that I spent the most time on. So probably the most proud of. And there was some, this is probably a weird segue, but there's some Reddit threads about whether or not Under the Silver Lake ripped it off. There's some people that make that claim. I'm not sure where I come down on that, although there are a series of weird coincidences and a lot of plot overlap, not so much plot overlap, but moments. But I don't know, you know, it could be osmosis. It could be a reasonable, you know, like-minded, movie saturated weirdos might come up with a similar kind of thing. Mostly that it's not the movies as much as the dog stuff in that movie is very similar to the dog themes and the subplot with the dog killer. That stuff is probably the closest, but yeah. So there's an unofficial movie version. So if you want to watch that one, you can go and watch. You can go watch the unauthorized film version, and you get double the blow.
That's interesting. Well, one of the things too about well, I'm going to start segueing into Head Cleaner a little bit, but you mentioned writing about Louisville, and Louisville is a very interesting city. It's very strange because it's in Kentucky, but it doesn't feel like it's entirely Kentucky.
Sure. It's a college town. It's kind of an oasis in Kentucky. It's like a many college towns, but
Yeah.
I think it's fair to say that what makes Louisville unique outside of the college town is also part of Louisville, more so than some college towns. But it's absolutely unique. Did you live there at some point?
No, I didn't. I'm from Bloomington, Indiana, so we were 2 hours north. But our connection was that our hardcore scenes were connected. We used to go to a lot of endpoint shows in Louisville, right? And in the 90s, and which of course Duncan Barlow is a writer who's been on this podcast. Duncan and I have been friends for like 30 years. Before either one of us were writing, we knew each other through punk rock. And it's interesting because one of the earliest Midwestern punk rock bands came out, Squirrel Bait, came out of Louisville. Louisville's always had an active music scene. And since I lived 2 hours north of there, we used to go to shows there a lot. And we used to bring Louisville bands to play in Indiana. So that, I guess that's my weird, my connection to Louisville is, you know, also like Bardstown Road and Ear Ecstasy is a record store. I would drive 2 hours, save up money, and plan like I'm going to go to Ear Ecstasy, and because they're going to have music I can't get in my town, right?
That's absolutely what I did. I was there when that went under. I was very excited to find Ear Ecstasy, and then they went out of business while I was still living there.
That's a crazy good record store.
And it was great.
Yeah,
very I found good. The spin-off band of one of those guys from the Bad Seeds. I'm blanking on the name of it, but it was like Kid Congo Powers and the something Pink Monkey Birds, something like that. It's an amazing album. Somebody told me about it. They said you're really into Nick Cave, like every young man, Gen X and young man. You love Nick Cave, but you should check out Kid Congo Powers, who was in the band, went on to be in the Cramps for a minute, and then did his own thing. And I said, it sounds like nothing I'd listened to, but I picked it up, and it was a huge find. And I'd only ever seen it on the shelf at Ear Ecstasy, so that was I was very excited to go there whenever I got a chance. And then one day they were gone. Like even pre-pandemic, they didn't survive just the end of media.
Well, if people, I know this is like a weird deep dive thing, but if people are interested in, I learned a lot about the music scene in Louisville. I had Rob Pennington on, who's the vocalist of Endpoint and By the Grace of God, which is one of the biggest hardcore bands to come out of. And he's been a punk rocker in Louisville since the early 80s. And he and I went really deep on this podcast. I'm not sure which episode it is, but we went really deep into, he taught me a lot about Louisville's music history. And it was very fascinating because the one-to-one of how these bands came along, you know, was very fascinating. So I find Louisville to be a very interesting city. So you perked my interest.
That was very interesting. Guitar Case has Bardstown Road action in it. So if you're like Bardstown Road, there's plenty of that Guitar Case. That's where we live behind it. We live right off Bardstown Road. If you can picture it, there was a McDonald's on there. That was the least hip spot of Bardstown Road had a McDonald's. We lived right behind it. And I remember distinctly when we first got there, we were getting a new washing machine in our upstairs apartment, and somebody came to buy the old one, and he showed up armed. There's like a young guy. He comes in and he says, "When I saw where your address was, I thought I better show up packing." I'm like, "Really? But you mean you're a mile away from the college? Did you not think you'd survive the trip to buy this washer?" And he shows me his gun. He's like, "Yeah, just in case." And I'm thinking, were you scared that this was my long con was to pretend like I was selling a washing machine to get you in here? And then I ended up having to help him carry it down the steps, even though the ad specifically said, bring somebody to carry it. I'm not carrying this thing down the steps. And he says, "Hey man, can you just help me get this down the stairs?" So that's just fascinating that there are some locals around Louisville who think that Bardstown Road is the scariest place that they've ever been, where they had to come heavily armed. So there's sort of that towny college clash that you see anywhere, right?
Yeah, we used to always. I remember when we drive to Louisville, always bring our skateboards so we could skate around the area. Like we'd pack, like jam them in the car, and we'd always plan time to skate around Louisville before shows started.
That's
So
awesome.
I have fond memories of Louisville, and most of the kids that I know that are kids, they're all adults or old people now. But a lot of the friends we made in Louisville were all like really, really great people. And on that note, I recommend Duncan Barlow's book, The City Awake, is one of my favorites of his.
Okay.
And he's a great writer that came out of that, and he teaches in an MFA program now. So, but in South Dakota. So, anyways, so on to Head Cleaner. Let's get into this book because we could nerd out about Louisville for a long time, I'm sure. So, Head Cleaner, obviously, there's been a resurgence lately of a little interest in VHSs, and partially I think because of Roger Avery and Quentin Tarantino's podcast, their Video Archives podcast, and the fact that they're like actively they're kind of actively promoting the idea that VHS is their chosen thing, but they're also, Quentin like had his whole video store moved. He bought the video store and moved it into his basement, basically. So he has, and not everyone can do that, obviously, right? Yeah. He has the resources, but I like that he's talking about VHS as a medium, because one of the things they do on that podcast sometimes is tell stories about running the video store. And there's a very unique experience that young people today know nothing about, which is, what it meant to, like, the culture that was around a video store. Like,
well, go ahead. Just to jump in real quick, they will never know what it's like, the pressure to make a choice of a film, to commit to it, and then that's right. And that's the one movie you're going to have for about 24 to 48 hours, just because you're not going to not watch it because you paid for it. You got to bring it back in a day or two, depending.
Yeah.
So just the pressure of going in and selecting a single film, taking it home with you like a fucking dog from the pound, and you're like, and this is our entertainment for the evening. Like that is something where everything is too many choices. That's why there's memes about people just, their entertainment is endlessly cycling through menus, looking at all the options. You don't have to make that choice. But anyway, yeah,
and I like to walk around the video store for a long time.
Sure. And that might be the version of cycling through the menu, is walking around the aisles.
And so one of the things that happened is you'd see the same video box a couple times, and maybe you didn't get it, but you built up in your head like what you thought that movie was going to be, like all the times you were there. Now, I recently told this story online, and it is obviously inspired by reading your book, but there was this movie called DEFCON 5 that had this amazing poster, right?
Oh, yeah. Skeleton Astronaut, yeah.
Yeah, Skeleton Astronaut. And they didn't have it at my video store that we rented from, but for us, there was a grocery store in Indiana called Marsh, and the Marsh on the south side of Bloomington, which wasn't even our primary grocery store, is one we just went to every once in a while. They had a little video rental section. And every time we'd go to Marsh, because I didn't want to spend time following my mom around looking for food, I would wander their video section. And I kept seeing this DEFCON 5, and it looked so fucking cool.
I think it's 4, but you're
4, whatever, 5.
I'm with you. That just shows how you wanted it to be a little bit better. DEFCON 5 absolutely is a better title.
The DEFCON 4 was this movie that I saw forever. And so eventually we had to get membership at Marsh just so I could rent this movie, to get the video membership, and rented it and took it home, and it fucking sucked.
I think.
But I tried to convince myself.
I'm not going to defend DEFCON 4, but maybe just a tad, where, like, should something be punished because it had a great artist? You know what I mean? Like, if somebody was, I think that whoever made that art was told a very loose version of what that movie's about. That all the missile satellite stuff is just sort of a bookend to it, where it's almost immediately just a sort of, what is it, like a Mad Max knockoff? It's just sort of people running around in rags, fighting the mutants. It's just a cheap sort of survival movie. But yeah, that your experience is, I think, consistent with everyone who rented DEF CON 4 and thought that you were getting something that, I think there is a juxtaposition between skeleton and astronaut and the missiles, and it was right around the nuclear scare.
Right.
So we had The Day After and we had Threads. So you had the serious version of this is what you should be afraid of. But to take it fully into the genre and make a horror movie with the nuclear scare, there was something about that box. I mean, there's nothing crazy about thinking.
No, there's like, once I posted that, like 6 people said like that happened to me exactly.
Yeah, it promised a lot. It didn't deliver.
So here's the thing, Hollywood. If you're out there, I'm willing to write DEF CON 5, right? 5, and match that poster. Inspired by that poster. I
don't know what kind of, if you have the technology, you should put the poster up at this moment when you finish this to show what you promise, what you'd promise. I had that experience with Death Stalker. I don't know if you've seen the cover for that. It shows sort of there's a giant with sort of a pig's head and a big flail or a big mace in his hand, and he's sort of threatening some scantily clad women. None of that shit. There is somebody with a pig's head in it, but it certainly doesn't look like that that very like heavy metal magazine cover that it had, and that was a disappointment. And recently, Galaxy of Terror, that has that cover with some sort of worm gargoyle creature swooping in on the woman's, like, oh no. That is the most interesting sequence in it, but again, another Roger Corman kind of knockoff. I think that's the consistent thing that's happening with all 3 of these movies.
Second unit director James Cameron, by the way.
That's true. Yeah, and you can tell because it's a dry run for Aliens. But the all 3 of these movies, amazing cover art, Roger Corman-esque terribleness. So I don't know if you get burned over and over by that. It's not. Maybe it's not as much of a betrayal the younger that you get betrayed, because that was a common thing, is when you made the choice we were just talking about, you pick that movie, you pick DEF CON 4 and go home with it. Maybe by the time if you spend more time with it, you convince yourself you didn't waste your time. Did you convince yourself, okay, I'm committed to this movie for the next 24 hours. Maybe you're a little more forgiving. You pulled it up fairly recently to watch it, and you don't have to do that to yourself anymore. You could immediately bail out of it, but maybe that's why you thought, what is this? I don't have to watch this crap. I'm just trying to psychoanalyze the people that took home DEF CON 4 and maybe forgave it enough to make it a semi-cult hit. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, and that's the thing, is there's all kinds of different things like that with video store culture, that when you're dependent on the video store for your entertainment, and you're going to make the choice. There's also the movies that the particular people that worked in the store champion. There's ones that maybe they had a display or whatever. The ones that you just built up in your head, this idea, of what you're going to do, balanced with, like, at the time for us in Indiana, was like a big thing growing up in Indiana was that we had a horror host, Sammy Terry, that would show horror movies, and sometimes it was like a big deal to find the movie that you watched on Sammy, right? And say like, oh, I'm gonna get to see this one uncut or without commercials, without the guy talking to the spider on a string before the movie. Not that there's anything, I mean, I love Sammy Terry, and Sammy Terry is beloved to all of us from Indiana at our age. That's how I saw Phantasm for the first time. Hammer horror movies were through Sammy Terry. But a lot of it too was, if you missed a movie on Sammy Terry, and now I used to tape them all in case I fell asleep because it was Friday night and it was school night, I was tired. And that's how I ended up with all these amazing double features, because they had Black Belt Theater on afterwards. And that inspired my novel, Hunting the Moon Tribe, which is Chinese vampires. And it was all because of that Sammy Terry double feature, where I had all these double features of Dracula's Risen from the Grave and the Chinese Super Ninjas.
Were those those hopping vampires? Are those?
Well, I had some hopping vampires, but not all my vampires were hopping. But nonetheless, that was where that came together. But I've seen with your novel, like it seems like with Head Cleaner, you're really trying to just explore that the VHS world. And even though the last blockbuster technically was in Bend, Oregon, you kind of put this in an amorphous, surreal place, right?
Right. It's not really a block. It's like a Hollywood video, showcase video / whatever. But yeah, it's the idea of them buying up all the old tapes to keep that business limping along. Is it's there's like a doom over it. And that's I worked at many video stores back in just out of high school. And then when I spent my short 12 years in undergrad, limping my way through an undergraduate degree, I had a lot of jobs in retail and video stores. And so the experience of, like you were just saying with the cover art on DEF CON 4, there is something to be said about looking at thousands of examples of genre artwork all day, and getting sort of enamored with the old media. And so that there is a lot of affection for those days of renting movies from a dying video store. The idea of a last blockbuster is not that far removed from the idea of the last projector. There's a reason for all these lasts. It felt like the end, and it felt like hanging on to something. And that there is something nostalgic about it, but also there's an attempt to punish those characters for relying too much on this nostalgia and for their own like obsessions with micromanaging their memories to where they can start messing with. If they had the ability to get what they want, which is some control over a future that's not going to happen. Their future is doomed as far as this culture. But if they're given the power to do it, you see what happens to them almost immediately is that it's nothing that they should be doing, because it puts them, they keep going backwards, and they're looping because they've opted to stay in this no future zone, an obsession with dead media. You can make some movies a little bit better if you had the power to change their endings, but you've become like a victim of your own memories. And so it's both the same thing, like I said earlier, about complaining about movies that you love. It's also complaining about a culture that is nostalgia soaked to a fault. And
that's kind of Eva's role, I think, a little bit, is that she over romanticizes it. And that's why in the back cover description she's called idealistic, is that she kind of takes that role. And then Jerry is the cinephile, who's like the know-it-all about cinema, right? And he's the one that is he the one that puts on a Black Sunday in the store? And then of course
I'm trying to make Black Sunday happen.
yeah. Well, and
not the Mario Bava, but there's already a Black Sunday that people love, but they don't. The Frankenheimer Black Sunday, not so much.
Yeah. Well, and so what's funny too is that and I know this too, because like my latest book, or the one that's coming out this summer, The Last Night to Kill Nazis.
There's another last in there, huh?
Yeah, I know. Well, it is. It's The Last Night. Yeah. And The Last Night to Kill Nazis, in many ways, like if I'm realistic, like about marketing it, I have to compare it to Inglourious Bastards because that's what people know. But to me, it's like Where Eagles Dare. And so it's funny because like sometimes when these older movies, you're like, and so I felt for Jerry in this, like wanting everyone to love and care about Black Sunday, because I feel that way about Where Eagles Dare. I'm trying to tell people like, no. You want to love Where Eagles Dare or Guns of Navarone, but people don't know about it. And so like I related to his like love of Black Sunday and like wanting to have it create this vibe in the store, which was funny. And so one of the things I want to say about Head Cleaner before we get into spoilers is that this book is very high concept and has some great sci-fi horror things going on, but it's also very funny because you're getting a chance to kind of take some of that meta commentary that you've been doing over the years and kind of spin it into the book. My favorite scene being the Pantera comparison scene, which I quoted in my review. That was the hardest I laughed in the book.
Yeah, the fact that the guy is the fact that Randy is obsessed with Pantera is one of those inconsistencies that sounds very realistic to me. Like, you think that when that guy's profile doesn't feel like, why would he be into Pantera? But I think it makes total sense when you talk to people that, they have that one quality that doesn't quite fit until you see it in action. And with Randy, he's doing I don't know. Well, I'll wait for the spoiler, but Randy's doing the mouth over the microphone thing, which is sort of a setup for something later. But
yeah,
the Pantera.
Well, no, and in a weird way, I related to it because I lived in a house full of vegan strange kids around '99, and we had all these long running jokes about Pantera, and
they're an easy target, that's for sure.
Yeah, and we had we had a Vinnie Paul shrine in our house with all these pictures of Vinnie Paul hung on the wall.
Well, have you seen there's like a video of where somebody's cut together all the Paul Stanley idiotic stage banter, where he's like, "Do you like alcohol? Welcome to." It's essentially Dr. Roxo from the Metalocalypse cartoon. So right. Paul Stanley was notorious for just having the dumbest between song stage banter, and somebody made a video that put it all together. But as I think one of the characters in Head Cleaner points out, they've got nothing on Pantera when it comes to that stage banter. If you listen to the 101 live proof or whatever the hell it's called, he seems to have a chip on his shoulder about people buying the album. I would highly recommend listening to that live album with him saying stuff like, "I see a lot of people out here who are listening to something they shouldn't be listening to. You got to listen to this in your car. And the next song is called Becoming." And you're just like, wait, what was that? Did people follow that? So the stage banter of Pantera, I think, is better than the songs.
Yeah. They are an easy target. But I really appreciated that part of the book. So a lot of the commentary is also about video culture and movies, and so obviously a lot of your time in the video store, working in the video stores, bleeds onto the page.
Oh yeah.
Which anybody who's done that, they know. I mean, you listen to Roger Avery and Quentin Tarantino's podcast, they still know the section headers, where everything was filed. You hear them talk about it. And so in the same way, I think that comes through in this book. There's a lot of this novel wouldn't exist if you hadn't worked in a video store, for example. Right.
Yeah, I think that's probably fair to say. And they had a much better control over their world. They had a good video store. I think that there's something, when you're in the trenches of retail for half your life, as many Gen Xers were, especially if you're in a video store that's a Blockbuster, which was the man, right? The Blockbuster wasn't the good one. Family Video wasn't the good one. The Showcase Video that I worked at, connected to a convenience store, was not where you wanted to be. It wasn't one of the hip ones, especially in Northwest Ohio. There was no video archives. So you had a limited control over your environment, but you could find the gem, the diamonds in the rough, and you could point them out in vain to your customers. You could say, do you want to watch Top Gun again? Or you could watch, I don't know, Johnny Handsome just came in and it's a little different. And they're like, okay. And then they come back and say, well, this sucked. and you're sitting there thinking, well, I'm doing the Lord's work. I'm just trying to get some good movies into the hands of these volunteer firemen who don't want to talk to me at all. So yeah, the struggle behind that counter I think hopefully shows up on the page, because I think about it a lot. I think about it more than I probably should. Those days,
Right.
those days of being behind a counter with other, stuck behind in the trenches with other people, dealing with a populace with an art form that you're trying to convince them to go one way or the other, and it's hopeless. It's I
I
can't
was
remember.
the annoying customer that used to always, like, when I was waiting in line, would butt in and say, like, you should get this, or you should
Mhm.
get that. So whereas I never actually worked in the store, I definitely, like, I know there have been times where I've convinced somebody to go back in and rent something else, but very specifically all the time, like, pointing people to the wider canon, for example, of, like, or somebody's up there and has seen Halloween a bunch of times and say, "Well, have you seen any other John Carpenter movies?" Right?
Right.
Like,
Sure.
like you should see Prince of Darkness. You really should. And then and they're I think that's a part of the experience that is obviously inspiring this. So the story itself, before we get into full blown spoilers that people should know, is that there is almost a mystical VCR in this book that kind of rewrites the multiverse, by with rewinding and pausing and some things, and I know that sounds like super weird, but in the context of how you unveiled it in the narrative flow, they're trying to seek out a VCR that had been rented and
Yeah.
had gotten magical late fees, right?
Yeah, if you remember, I
Like,
don't know if you remember that there was one of those articles going around about somebody had a tape, or they'd rented a movie 20 years ago, and it says late fee up to $5,000, and so it was one of those viral articles. That,
yeah,
not that they probably could get anybody to pay anything but the price of the film, but it was one of those viral articles that I thought was interesting, and so this is a play on that they are aware of that article, and the characters in this are thinking, well, we should do that too. Let's look at our late list. Who's the worst on it? And there was somebody who rented years ago a VCR and a stack of tapes. And so because the one character is sort of trying to impress the other one, and they go out to look for this VCR, which it turns out the stack of tapes, many of them, if I remember correctly, I haven't read it in a while, many of these tapes contain real footage, and if this VCR can change the footage or change the ending of films wherever you pause it and stretch the tape, then if you could change the real footage, then you might change things that are happening in reality, depending on the film. But mostly it's about going to get a VCR back, which they asked me to do when I started working at Family Video. Honestly, I couldn't believe that this was real. They said, so once a week, you're going to get in the car with the assistant manager, and you're going to go get our games back, our Super Nintendo games, from people that rented them. And I
you were
couldn't
like
believe
the video repo man.
I couldn't believe it, because it just, like, can you imagine doing that today, knocking on someone's door? I mean, it'd be such a dangerous thing to do it. And just to, anyway, they sent me to get, I did it once, and we did get a Super Nintendo back and a stack of games, and it went fairly smoothly. We went to the door, and some young guy comes up. He's like, "What?" Said, "We can see the Super Nintendo back there. That's ours. You know, well, we're not going to call the cops or anything, but we rented it a month ago. Can we just have it back?" He's like, "Okay," and gives it back to us. And we get back in the car, and I'm just like, heart beating. Said, "I'm never going to do this again. I can't believe you. Why would anybody do this? How are we getting extra? Are we getting hazard pay for this?" So in the book, the idea is, what would happen if that was the nightmare that I imagined was going to happen? What if it happened? What if you're in the house? What if there's something going on upstairs? All the what ifs. So it was fun to play with that, because it was a really disturbing memory from my video store days.
Right. So this is a 5-star book for me. And I'm not just saying that because your face
I
is on my
appreciate that.
screen.
Thanks.
I really loved it. I laughed a lot. I thought it was weird. It made my head go a couple different directions. For my dickheads out there, I would say, the thing that is most PKD about it, is the attention to the changes and little details. Phil loved
Oh yeah.
stories where the universe was just slightly different. And that's one of the things that kind of goes on here, but we'll talk about that in spoilers. So I'm not the language and stuff is a little bit more verbose than most PKD, but people do always want to know if I'm going to make this a dick-like suggestion, and I'm milling that as a dick-like suggestion for the Dickheads podcast, because I do think that it has enough PKD territory. So, and I know some people would want to know what I think on that regard, as the now 5 years underwater dickhead that I am. So on that note, we're going to go to spoilers here in a little bit. Is there anything else you want to say to people before we tell people to pause and go read the book?
Nope. And if they pause, I mean, that's dangerous. That's a dangerous move. Pausing anything
could change.
It's a destructive move. Don't pause. Don't ever pause anything.
Or you could just close out your podcast app and then come back to it, so you don't have to actually push the pause button.
No.
So,
the universe recognizes loopholes like that and would punish you accordingly.
right.
That's just a way to pause without pausing. At least have the courage to pause.
Yeah. So here's the thing. I recommend Head Cleaner. You can get it most book-worthy places. I recommend.
Yeah, there's a little more distribution with this one than my last book. I think it's shown up some places. People are sending me some pictures, which is fun. But you should be able to get it anywhere.
Should be able to get it anywhere. I always recommend bookshop.org or ordering through Mysterious Galaxies, who I'm repping, who's our local bookstore here, and I want them to get more indie stuff. So it's always good to go through them. So I always recommend that. So yeah, I'm gonna pause and take a break here, and then we're gonna do spoilers. Okay, we're back. Of course, it was about a second or nanosecond for the folks out there listening, but for us, we took a little pee break, and now we're in spoilers. So if you're listening at this point, either you don't give a shit about spoilers, or you've already read Head Cleaner, and again, I recommend reading it, and then we'll talk about it. So the first thing that I want to get into some parts of the book that I really liked, and we already talked about. There's a part where one of your characters says everybody goes back in time to kill Hitler, but I totally buy a shit ton of Netflix stocks.
Well, maybe not anymore.
Yeah, exactly. And then, but you had, this is one of the scenes where you talk about how the kids don't know how they have it, but a lot of what's going on in this book is, and part 3 is called Warthog Day. So in a sense that you're kind of playing with the whole like Groundhog's Day thing of like, in this part of the book. Do you want to talk about like where the structure of this book came from? Because I think that, because what I like to do in spoilers is I like to think of this as like where we talk to other writers about, and get into nitty gritty of how the book was constructed.
Sure. Yeah, this one, it originally was a short story. The first, I would say maybe like the first 20 pages was originally a short story, and it was just kind of fleshing out what if you went to go retrieve a VCR in the late movies and you found something horrible at the house. And it was a submission for Perpetual Motion Machine's Lost Films anthology.
Oh, that makes sense. Yeah.
So yeah, it was sort of, here's a tape, somebody's recording their own death as a way for immortality. So it fit their theme. I figured Max would like it. And he did. He liked it. And then I guess this is kind of obnoxious if you get a story accepted, do you heavily rewrite it? You probably shouldn't do that. But instead, I started really thinking about that story, and it turned into a novella. And I messaged Max and said, so this story is getting pretty big. I went in to look for typos, and I have all sorts of ideas of where this is going. I'm like, do you want something that's twice as long? And he was like, God damn it, yes, send it to me, whatever. So I sent him the bigger one, which is essentially a novella at this point. And he put it at the very end of the book so it wouldn't break up the pace. And at that point, the story it became the deaths of all these characters, and whether, if they were to record their own deaths, could they remain on a videotape forever and possibly survive it. So that was initially the entire story, was the death of the 3 video store people being shot, but one of them is recording it, so maybe they could survive it and sort of loop back around. So then, this is very spoiler heavy. I started thinking about what would happen if this whole thing was told from the point of view of different characters. Their own impression of it would not only be different, but also their own experience of it would be different, because it goes into the theme of your memory of a film that could be different or flawed is not necessarily any less valid than anyone else's changed memory of a film. So their memory of the experience, if it's changed, what if that means it's actually happening the way they experience it, which means now there's 3 different versions of these events. And then this is where it really went nuts. I started thinking, is there a way to fake time travel in a believable way? Could I make this entire story seem like there was a time travel, time loop situation, multiverse situation, but what if it was all faked? So as an exercise, I tried to find a way to make it feasible to fake that sort of thing. And then at the end, it's like, did it really happen or didn't it happen? You can make your decision about whether it happened or not. But I think that there are enough possible answers to steer you, hopefully believably, in the direction that they were being manipulated into thinking that this was happening when it wasn't. Of course, did they die? Were they drugged? There are a series of moments where they're certainly gassed. Somebody puts Eva, as a former addict, is sent into some sort of addiction loop. So, but I don't know. In my mind, it's kind of like, planting evidence on O.J. Simpson. He's absolutely guilty, but the cops were corrupt. So you planted evidence on a guilty guy. So it's kind of like what's going on with this book. I planted evidence that it didn't really happen, but come on, did it not happen? Could it not happen? So
one of the things that's really interesting, this is the PKD. I think that it's very similar to PKD, which is the changing of the movies, right? So like PKD always liked little changes where, like, doors changed, like you only knew you were in another universe because the door used to open out instead of opening in.
Yeah.
That was like a big deal, right? And so for me, one of the things that was really fascinating is how, like, they start cluing into this because, like, the ending of movies starts changing, and then we saw Titanic, but, like, how could that change? Because that was based on a real event. Did the real event change?
Right.
And how did you, like, work this in, and what was your thinking in doing this part of the book? Because I love that.
Yeah, thanks. It was kind of like, it was part of a meme that I had been seeing where you might have seen this on Twitter, I think it was, where it says fix a movie in one line, or fix a movie in one word. And so the characters start playing that game, and it's foreshadowing for what they're going to do, which is if you fix a movie in one word, can you change a movie in one scene? And if you change a movie in one scene, are you changing the world in one movie? So things escalated in that way. So it started with the game they play, which is fix a movie in one line. And I think they're playing with The Matrix becomes a conversation about how there are things that could have solved that. And so it turns into an extension of that. And like you said, if the Titanic never sinks, so the Wikipedia page changes, and if it's a real event, then if we're in a world where the Titanic never sank, the pebble's going out from you're dropping the pebble in the water, minor changes start. It's not quite the butterfly effect, but it is
Right.
within movies, especially when movies feed other movies. So you've got movies using scenes from other movies.
The
So
fist, and that's the comparison you made with Fistful of Dollars
yeah,
and Back to the Future 3 later in the book, right?
right, exactly. And
Yeah.
same, like, I don't know if you saw The Limey with Terrence Stamp. Uh,
Yes.
Great film. And for flashbacks, that Soderbergh did something amazing where he went back and found an old movie that Terrence Stamp had made when he was a young man, which was a gangster movie, Poor Cow. And he put those sequences of him as a young man in this other film in his film as flashbacks, which that sort of meshing of memory, and like I started to imagine, what if somebody saw that and had memories of the other film, and it's like, is this one feeding off this one, or is this one feeding off this one? And so yeah, long story short, going down the rabbit hole of changing films, and therefore by proxy changing lives, is where it all starts spinning out, right? And that's where the Warthog Day, the Groundhog Day thing.
Right.
If I was saying this to somebody the other day, if you actually were in a Groundhog Day situation where you felt like you were repeating a day, if you started to look around and think this looks familiar, it would be hellish. It wouldn't be, and there's some of that in the film Groundhog Day, and I guess in the original script it was even darker. But it taking away that sort of, and if you could do that to somebody, if you could convince somebody that they were repeating a day, which is what the book hints at, is that somebody's trying to convince me by sending me these tapes, manipulating the imagery, manipulating text, manipulating there's like static pages that they're pretending to be websites to convince people that they're repeating a day. Could you get them to do something for you? So all that stuff I think is terrifying. So that's why the flip from Groundhog Day to Warthog Day, and plus that's Randy's chapter, and Randy he's the one who has the biggest arc because he comes in as an asshole. It's like, how can you redeem this character? This guy's terrible. So it gives you something to do. Whereas Jerry they essentially start off as opposites. And then, I don't know if you remember, they switch shirts that has their names on them. And at the moment they switch shirts, they've switched personalities. They're now, Randy is heading for some sort of relatability or some sort of sympathy, and Jerry is heading for some sort of devastating comeuppance.
I admit I did not notice that, but that's really cool. Yeah.
Now does Jerry deserve it? I don't know. I felt like he deserved it because he's the kind of person you get sick of. I don't know. I needed to punish somebody, and it felt like Randy had was an easy out.
So in a lot of horror and genre work, you have like the thing that kind of pushes, the fear button. And in this book, there's an actual fear button in the sense of pushing play and pause and all those things. Now, the idea was, and early in the book, it's easy to think of what they're dealing with is like a mystical multiverse editing VCR, right? Yeah. Is what it seems like they're dealing with. And you mentioned that there's some sleight of hand there. But Can you talk to me about like what the power of the pause and the play button is in this book?
I guess.
And sorry for the bark.
I guess at first the idea is that if you pause a movie, let's say there's a scene in a movie that you really like, so you keep pausing it, and this is from kids these days will not know the pain of the best scenes in films having static lines going through them from being paused over and over again. So if you see there's a particularly violent scene, or if there's nudity or a great sequence on VHS, people would watch those scenes over and over. So you get those tapes back and they would have lines through them from where they were paused. Because by pausing the movie, you're starting to stretch it. It's sitting on the head, which is where you get the title, the head cleaner. You're sitting on the video head and you're stretching it ever so slightly, and that's why you get the lines. So the idea is that this particular VCR, if you pause it and then you rewind and play it again, it's stretched the tape, but it's also stretched reality, and it's made some sort of other option has happened. So if there's it's like a binary switch. So if there's something that happened, now you're going to get the opposite of it. If somebody died in that scene, now they live. If somebody survived, and now they die. So you find that because it happens at the most popular scenes, it drastically changes these films. And so throughout the book, the characters start to doubt their own memories of it. Kind of the Mandela effect is kind of shit on a little bit in the book. So the idea is that, well, I remember, you start to realize that they're saying, wait, you're saying in this movie the Titanic sinks? So then you realize, wait, the characters think that the Titanic didn't sink. So now they're confused as well. Or is it the butterfly effect where in their world the Titanic didn't sink, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So so in a nutshell, you've stretched the tape slightly and you've changed the outcome of the film. So moving forward, if you've done, let's say you're watching JFK, which becomes a pivotal film in the book, JFK uses the actual Zapruder film. So if people keep pausing in the dialogue of the movie JFK, they're pausing and rewinding. He says, back and to the left, back and to the left. So now here you have an example of where the movie is commanding them to stop their own film, back into the left, back into the left. So now they've made it, if it's the switch, so now has JFK survived because the Zapruder film is being stretched? And then the characters become obsessed with getting them their own deaths on tape so that somebody could stretch the tape and bring them back. Then they tape their demise on the JFK tapes and hide them because they're terrible at alphabetizing. But that's essentially what the VCR is supposedly doing, is physically stretching tapes. And it's revealed later that that VCR, the VidStar top loader, is the last of its kind, the last one to come off the assembly line, which means it's hinting that everything that comes off the assembly line last is given some sort of power over the material it has. So the last tape player does something. There's a hint that the last everything is in the basement at the end. Somebody's collecting the last everything. The collectors, which may or may not be the same person over and over again, is collecting the last device because of the possibilities. Or are they? Or is it just an attempt? Is it just a psychological experiment to see what people would do if they thought their lives were being repeated? But that's what the machine's supposed to be doing.
I remember Josh Olson recently on his podcast mentioned that A History of Violence was the last movie made on VHS.
Yeah, I just discovered that recently. I think I was looking it up on eBay, and somebody was selling the History of Violence VHS tape. I had just seen the recent Cronenberg Crimes of the Future, and I thought I should really flesh out my Cronenberg collection. And the VHS tape was like $150. I thought, what the fuck? Why? And the person said, be a part of history in the eBay description. I thought, oh my God, what did I miss? And I Googled it, and it said, sure enough, History of Violence, the last videotape to come off the assembly in North America. VHS is still being produced worldwide. I'm sure there's multiple versions of it, but in North America, that's the last of its kind. And now I need to get one. Which I don't think at the time, I think I missed the boat on it, but I'm always on the lookout for it, at least for the past 4 visits to Rasputin's. I figure somebody's going to take one back and not know that they're dealing with history there. But yeah, by the logic of this book, the History of Violence would be infused with some sort of powers because
Speaking of Rasputin's, by the way, have you been to the Rasputin in Berkeley?
Yes. Yeah, there were two there, right? And then now there's just the one. Rasputin's and Amoeba are like a block apart.
Yeah, the Rasputin is in the location where Philip K. Dick worked at the last record store. It's the record store he worked at is where the Rasputin's is now.
So this is the Rasputin's that's still there that has the basement.
Yep.
Wow.
He worked in that. He worked in the record store that was in that building before Rasputin's.
I wonder if there's any paraphernalia left over from the record store, because there's a fiberglass cop that stands at the door and says, don't steal shit. It's got to be some stuff left over from, if it's the same. It certainly feels like an old record. It's drafty. It's got a lot of, records too. So I wonder how much is left over from the stock that he used to work there. Rasputin's is famous for just taking over old spaces. Isn't that their gimmick?
Yeah. So in the first record store that he worked at, because he worked at 2 locations owned by the same guy, Herb Hollis. And they sold the first TVs at the one. What's the main strip of Berkeley? I'm brain farting the name of it.
No, I'm
Shattuck. or starts with an S.
Where is that, the street that it's on?
Yeah, I think Shattuck is the main street of Berkeley, but I could be. Anyways, it's a Bank of America now, where the first record store was, and in the basement of that building is where Philip K. Dick lost his virginity as well. Stuff, fascinating stuff. But anyways, so
Talk about
you mentioned Rasputin, and I figured I'd
talk about stretching the tape.
Yeah, exactly.
Telegraph Road. Is it Telegraph Road you're thinking of in Berkeley?
Whatever the main strip of
maybe not.
The main strip of Berkeley. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
So he lived a couple blocks from there with his mom in high school. And then it's funny because it was a big deal to him to move out from his mother's house in high school. And if you walk to the apartment where he first lived when he moved out, that was this big deal. It takes 4 minutes. And he was very excited. Like he thought he had moved away from his mom and really like got independence. So
it's like in Zodiac. It's like in Zodiac when Gyllenhaal points out with the salt shaker that all the murders took place within the same walking distance.
Right. So Head Cleaner, it's a weird book. So when you come to the end, like, you were trying to go for this idea of, well, what if it was all like a trick or whatever? How do you feel about how the third act plays out? Like, I thought it was really good. Like, it kept me going through the end, but I got to tell you, like, on an honest level, like, and I'm fine with this. I wasn't quite sure what to think about the end, about what was the reality of it, which I'm A-okay with reading a book. And speaking specifically, it's a long time, fan of bizarro surrealism and Philip K. Dick. I'm fine with that.
But yeah, I was gonna say you're the perfect forgiving audience for an open-ended ending, and it does ask the reader to have to be okay with not an easy answer. But as far as I've noticed that there's been some frustration. This is a book that has gotten out of the bubble a little bit, as far as there's a writing scene that I've been involved in for a few years here. And this seems to have gotten a little bit outside of that, where it's interesting to see what just the average reader that comes across it says. And it sounds like there's some frustration, which is fun. There's some frustration with the repetition right before that final reveal. So this is a spoiler, but when it comes to be like the third time that they end up in the same place, that they're still in a basement. Now it's like a turducken, right? They're in a basement within a basement within a building, where somebody rebuilt the video store within the basement of this building as like a simulation. When it's revealed that they're back in the basement, it's kind of like the van in Inception that goes over the edge, but it's taking forever to get there. It sounds like there are some people out there that are like, let's get it going. But for fans of this sort of thing, I think that the joy is not ever escaping it. I think that the hell of being stuck in the same place, especially when you're stuck with the people that you've grown to have these conflicts with, I think that that's the fun of it. Like, I don't know where else to go. It is sort of an insular story where the act of not just repeating the day, but they keep ending up in a basement. At least in the last third.
Well, and I don't think that there's any accident that you spend a bunch of time talking about the rewinder, which is a technology that people don't think about now. Yeah. That you'd have this machine that you just shove in and rewind a tape.
Right.
And it was funny when you mentioned that, because we had our own rewinder at home, right? And we were told that like it saves the head on your VCR.
Yes, it does. It doesn't stretch your tapes.
Right. And so you use the rewinder and look, I had a Betamax, right? And when the family upgraded to VHS, because we had to, the Betamax went into my bedroom. And like, because I had a bunch of Sci-Fi and Sammy Terry episodes and V the Final Battle on Betamax, and I wore that shit out, but that Betamax survived. Like, we got it in like 1980, and I used it I know, through at least 91, so that thing went for
Well, the irony is that those rewinders are destructive, that they rewind so fast. Most of the better VCRs, when they get to the end of rewinding, they slow down. You can hear the motor slow down, so it doesn't give it the jar at the end. These rewinders go bam, and they'll snap your tape right off the reel. We had rewinders at the video store just because we get a bunch of them back. They weren't rewound, so we're sticking them in rewinders, slapping them down as we're putting stuff away. And like every 20th tape or so, we'd hear it go bam and pull it out, and it had pulled it off the tape. So the attempt to save your VCR with a rewinder destroyed more than a few tapes, which it turns out are worth so much more. VCR is $20 now. Some of these tapes are going for insane prices. So,
here's the thing.
Kind of funny.
Like anything else, you could buy the expensive rewinder that slowed down. So I know, for example,
did they have one?
Yes, they did have one. It was more expensive because we had one that would slow down. Like,
no, I think I had one that looked like a car. So they wanted it to look neat rather than save your tapes.
Yeah, because it had I remember the sound. It'd start off like super fast, and then it was about to pop up, like
a toaster.
Yeah, when it slowed down. So I don't know if I'm just reading crazy things into it but I thought the rewinder was a big hint in the book.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. You can't overanalyze this one. This one's impervious to overanalysis. Because it's all, whatever you think of it, I'm sure it's in there. I'm sure your theme is in there.
What's your favorite hidden part of it that you put into it that you haven't seen anyone find yet?
Well, as far as a hook that I haven't seen, I mean, the idea of a magic VCR is a little corny, as far as, that's almost an Adam Sandler plot. But the idea of faking time travel to make somebody convinced that it's happening to them, I have yet to see anyone do that. So I'm proud of that plot point being new. As far as any sort of Easter eggs, if that's what you're asking, there are a lot of there's probably a little more Taco Bell symbolism than is any sane person would put into a book. The Taco Bell stuff, the shadow menu, the Meximelts, all that stuff is an unironic love of Taco Bell, which I say that in California at your own peril, where there's really good authentic Mexican food. But as I was talking to somebody about recently, it's not Mexican food. It's different. It's some sort of nostalgia food. It's some sort of thing. It's not just the reality of the book is intangible. Taco Bell is intangible. They had a whole article about how it's not even meat. It's just some protein fluff. So just the artificial nature and enjoyment of Taco Bell, there are some Easter eggs regarding that and regarding the shadow menu and the shadow government. There's also, I'm obsessed with people taking, quote, decompression showers in films. So I snuck one in there where there's no real opportunity to take a shower. But I snuck that in there because I just love when people send them to me now. They see so many of them. If you're watching anything these days, there'll be a shot of somebody with two hands on the wall, pondering whatever they've become. And people just, shows and movies today just plow through that cliche like it's anything that's not silly at this point. So I love that they exist still.
iRobot has the best one of those, I think.
Oh, really? See, what I didn't remember that. And I've seen iRobot at least 3 or 4 times, but he takes one in that.
Yeah, absolutely. He absolutely does. I would say that the fake time travel, it's not exactly the same, but it did remind me of PKD's Time Out of Joint, which is been ripped off to become the Truman Show. Right? The Truman Show is very, where
sure, yeah, there's definitely
his whole existence was he was faked to be in the 50s when really they
Absolutely.
were using it to program a war in the 90s,
Sure.
right?
I guess M. Night's he ripped that off with The Village too. He ripped off that Philip K.
Yeah,
Dick.
and with Time Out of Joint, I favorably suggested Head Cleaner to a friend whose favorite PKD novel is Time Out of Joint.
Awesome.
And saying that like not everyone's going to see the connection with Time Out of Joint, but you will.
Yeah.
And so I think that that's there. But anything else like real the Taco Bell thing is there because I didn't notice that at all.
There's a lot of that. There's a lot of Primer in there. If people that are familiar with Primer, one of my absolute favorite films, some of them I gave a shout out to in the acknowledgments. Like I had to credit Primer because at some point the characters, to protect their existence, start recording their conversations just in case, like they're making an archive of their own lives. And that's absolutely inspired by Primer when they go back in time I think it's 8 hours back, and they want to replicate their conversations so that everything happens exactly the same without any deviation. So they're listening to the conversations they just had, and they're inserting the words that they already had. So that reference is in there. And plus the existential terror of Primer, the idea of if time travel is feasible, and if it can be done with this, and if it's this kind of analog version of it, you have to earn it. Like in Primer, to go back 8 hours, you have to sit in that box for 8 hours. You don't go blink and then you're there. You have to take in or if you want to go back a day, you have to sit. If you want to go back 24 hours, you got to sit in there 8 hours and then disassemble the box and put it into another box and then go back another 8 hours. And you have to eat in there and you have to wait it out, and you come out delirious because of all the time you spent there. But that's how you have to earn those hours back. So in this book, there's the effort of a loop like that is, it's destructive. It's destructive to their relationships, to their personalities. It's destructive to their families. Although the only family we see is Eva's, but you see how any repetition of a day is enough to destroy they become untethered in a way that is very much, I think, they're in Primer. I wish that guy would make more movies. He only did 2, and I think those 2 were masterpieces. And so I think there's a shout outs to that. And there's actually a show on YouTube called Welcome to the Basement, where they watch. The gimmick is one guy is trying to get through all the movies he's never seen. He's missed a lot of pivotal films. And he brings in his friend who may or may not have seen them before. And they talk about the movie. They watch them together, and then they talk about them in a vaguely MS3K kind of way, like they riff as they watch them, and then he talks about them. In Welcome to the Basement, they talk about an immersion tank where they watch a movie 5 times in 5 nights and see if new things emerge. And that's certainly an influence on this book, where you're seeing maybe 5 times the same situation and new things emerge. So I gave them a shout out in the credits as well, in the post credit sequence. Wait, do credits go up or do credits go down?
I think it depends. Well,
they go backwards in 7, so I guess they come down in 7.
Right.
So I noticed they were backwards. Anyway, the credits have shout outs to Primer and Welcome to the Basement.
So sorry, I've been trying to mute.
I'm not even hearing him. Yeah.
Okay. Well, it's pretty high pitched over here, but anyways, we're almost done. But Head Cleaner is a great book. I really recommend it obviously I would hope people here at this point have read it. One thing about my review of it is I tried not to get into these sci-fi things. I tried to just do the setup, just talk about the setup and then talk about the parts that I liked.
Yeah, I think focusing on the sci-fi elements, I think kind of give it is kind of a disservice, because it is about the it is about it's a conversational kind of book. That those, I don't want to say those things are window dressing, but I think the strength of it is the banter and the video store culture and kind of the experience of arguing with people that are the people you work with, if that makes any sense. Like it's very much grounded in workplace drama, not necessarily grounded in
Right.
a high concept plot, which it has, but
I might go back and add this to my review, but it seems like and I didn't think of this way when I was writing the review earlier today. Sorry, doggy. I'm coming to you soon. But the thing about it is that this book feels like a slipstream, like those conversations at the video stores opens up like a hole in the universe, and the people involved in this conversation are pulled into it. Is basically the idea.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Another book recommendation I'd like to give is I don't know if you've ever heard of Stuart Onan. I think a Pittsburgh author, wrote The Last Night at the Lobster. And it's a very slim little novel, probably considered a novella. But The Last Night at the Lobster is a Red Lobster is going out of business. They're going to be open one more night. And everything that happens there that night is what the book is about. Relationships are being severed. There's other relationships are being formed. The manager's trying to keep it all together. It's a very snowy night in Pittsburgh. And it was a huge influence. It's not necessarily a very eventful book, but if you're from that generation of retail service workers, video store workers, and you know what it's like to be there those nights, again, in the trenches, that book, I think, has got that vibe. And I hope that's what I try to do with Head Cleaner, is the vibe of being stuck at work and if work happens to be a multiverse time loop, it's also that sort of work, being stuck with your coworkers, is something I both miss and it's sort of a waking nightmare whenever I think about retail for decades. But it's a weird nostalgia. It's a nostalgia for terrible times, in the workplace.
All right, David, tell the folks where they can find you and your books, and let me know if there's anything else you want to add here at the end.
Sure. I guess I have a very outdated website that's under davidjameskeaton.com, but it does have links to all the books, but maybe the last two. It's both, it's outdated as in it's ancient, and also I haven't updated it. So you'd probably just go to Twitter, I guess. Is Twitter still exist? Spider Frogged is what I am on Twitter. Not much of a web presence these days, but absolutely find the book anywhere you find books. You should be able to find it, and it should lead you to the other books. Hansel and Gretel style. That's all I guess that's all I would say.
Well, and I hope to get this book out there to more sci-fi readers, because I think that's one of the things that I think sci-fi readers might, the horror crowd might know a little bit more of your work, but I think this is one that people who like the weird new wave sci-fi of the
I think A Scanner Darkly, the vibe of A Scanner Darkly, if not the plot, I think is very close. The way those guys are stuck together arguing about how many gears a bike has, I think that is a very similar vibe to this book. But I think you're a good audience for it. You're from the, are you
right? I am target audience. I know this.
Oh yeah.
I know target audience is a term we're told not to use anymore. And you don't want a targeted audience. You want an audience, right?
We'll just say like-minded.
Right. And on that note, I have a doggy to feed who's letting me know that. But I really enjoyed our conversation, David. And
this was fun. It was good. Nice to meet you for real. For real. This being real.
I got to remember to invite you to some when I do some panels, because I'm sure there's some that you would do really great on. Like the last series that we did was like 30s sci-fi. So if you're person who's new to this podcast came looking for that guy. I do cover all kinds of genre stuff, and I love the history of science fiction. And so I got a whole series on 30s science fiction that was kind of recent that people should check out. So thank you, Mr. Keaton. It was great having you on. Yeah. I have a suggestion for you off air, but well, it was great having you on. Anything else you want to say?
No, I think that's good. We don't want to get it. We don't want to make people think they're stuck in a time loop here.
Yeah.
You should do that. You should make the podcast just start over without it telling anybody about it. See how long they can endure it.
Yeah. Well, we'll see. All right. Well, it's good talking to you.
All righty.
All right. Thanks everybody.